Informed Choice Radio, episode 456, Getting Your Financial Together with Gaby Dunn.
Live from Sundial House Studios, this is Informed Choice Radio. Want to make the most of your money and your life? You've come to the right place. Now, here's your host, Martin Bamford.
In the first episode of her Bad with Money podcast, my guest today asked patrons at a coffee shop 2 questions. First, what's your favourite sex position? Everyone was game to answer, even the barista. Then she asked how much money was in their bank accounts. People were aghast. That's a very personal question, they insisted, and therein lies the problem. Gaby Dunn argues that our inability to speak honestly about money is our number one barrier to understanding it, leading us to feel alone, ashamed and anxious, which in turn makes us feel even more overwhelmed by it. In her new book, Bad with Money, Gaby reveals the legitimate systemic reasons behind our feeling of helplessness when it comes to personal finance, demystifying the many signposts on the way to getting our financial together, like how to choose an insurance plan or buy a car, sign up for a credit card, or take out student loans. Gaby is a best-selling author, journalist, television writer, actress, and LGBTQ activist living in Los Angeles. Her podcast, Bad with Money, was named one of the top 10 podcasts of 2016 by the New York Times. Along with her comedy partner, Alison Raskin, Gaby stars in, writes, and produces the YouTube channel Just Between Us, which has been viewed over 140 million times. Here's my conversation with Gaby Dunn, author and presenter of Bad with Money, in episode 456 of Informed Choice Radio. Gaby, perhaps you could start by, for listeners who don't know who you are, to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about you and a bit about what you do.
Sure. My name's Gaby Dunn. I'm a writer and podcaster, and I do a podcast called Bad with Money, which is like a finance podcast, but it's also about feelings and social justice and my own journey, and also figuring out, it's gotten increasingly political basically. And then I had a book called Bad with Money that came out in January, but I do lots of stuff. I TV write, and I have a comic book that comes out in October. So I kind of I'm just a writer all over the place, and I live in Los Angeles.
Where did the idea to start a podcast and write a book about Bad with Money come from? Because I first got to know you via your YouTube show with Alison, Just Between Us. I wouldn't have thought of you as a money person.
No, I would not have thought of myself as a money person. You're absolutely right. I wasn't. I was very bad with money. I never wanted to talk to anyone about it. I was very ashamed of the whole thing. I had come from sort of a lower middle class background, and I think a lot of people in LA are wealthy. And I just didn't realize it till I came out to LA. And so I thought that it was a personal moral failing. I was like, oh, something's wrong with me, that I don't have money, or that I'm not saving money. But slowly over time, it's become more clear that it's a systemic problem. And I've always been like a social justice person. I just never realized how much money tied into everything. So it just became increasingly clear to me that, especially in the US, medical debt, student loan debt, I mean, we have a lot of problems here in terms of caring for each other and making sure that the American dream, quote unquote, is able to actually happen for anyone other than a select few. I've always been involved in like LGBT rights and gun control and like stuff like that. But then all of a sudden it occurred to me how much money touched all of those things. It seems like it's out of left field for me, but then it kind of was this big awakening where I realized all of this stuff that I thought was my fault or other people's fault or poor people's fault or whatever is actually like by design. And that was really spooky. It was just, it just kind of started out with me asking questions. And I think that's a thing a lot of people are afraid to do. And then asking some questions opened up Pandora's box of problems in this country. So
are you finding then, as you're having these conversations on the podcast, as you're speaking to people about the book, that you're not alone in that respect? You know, lots of people face these similar thoughts about money.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely thought I was alone, and I would cry all the time about money. That was like my biggest trigger, is that I would just cry by myself about it. I didn't think anyone else had this problem. I didn't think anyone else was this quote unquote incompetent, or I had no concept of how anyone made money. I was like, how do you make money? How do you keep money? How does anyone have money when something bad happens, like they need an appendectomy or the car breaks down, or like, how does anyone do this? As I started doing the show, I talked to friends on the show, season 1, and then all my friends were like, oh yeah, I've had this problem. Oh yeah, I've had this. This is what I secretly do, or whatever. And then it also became people writing in, and it was like people were writing in like more than they've written into anything I've ever done. It was like masses of emails because it was just people being like, I've never heard anyone talk about this. I'm at a certain age where I'm like, well, it's too late for me to ask the obvious questions. I'll look like an idiot. Everyone knows this already. But if everybody was like, I can't ask because everybody knows, then guess what? Nobody knew.
Where's this stigma come from about money? I know you talk in the book about how you went into a coffee shop and people were prepared to tell you their favorite sexual position, but as soon as you asked them about their financial details, that was somehow shameful and embarrassing. So why is there this stigma around money?
I think because it's so tied to intellect. Like, people think that if you're good with money, you're a genius. And if you're bad with money, you're very stupid. It doesn't help that most of the financial media will call you stupid. They use the word stupid really frequently. I've watched a lot of it, and I'm always shocked by how often they tie financial troubles to your intelligence. I think people don't want to admit that they are quote unquote stupid, right? Or it's tied to your like moral, like your basic moral goodness or badness. So people that are good are wealthy and people that are bad are poor. It says a lot about your self-worth in a way that like it doesn't really make sense because it's so out of your control most of the time. So I think people just like to be smug. And I think like it just becomes this thing where, I don't know. I mean, part of me also thinks that like rich people have made it up. Here's my like tin hat. I think rich people have been like, no, money is taboo. Don't talk about money. It's so tacky to talk about money. And then they were like, we got them. We got the poor people. Now they'll never talk to each other about money and will stay rich. That's what I've figured out.
I love a good conspiracy theory. That's perfect.
I think it's true.
So if we've got this society, we've got this system that's doing everything it possibly can to prevent us from talking about money, to hold us down really in that respect. How do we become good with money in that system?
I mean, talking to each other is huge. A lot of the research that I did in the book showed that like statistically your neighbors or people in your community. So people, and I took that to mean like people that are also queer or people that are the same race as you or people that you hang out with that like also play D&D, whatever, like people that are similar to you will have similar financial advice that you would need. So it actually makes a lot of sense to talk to the people around you and be like, hey, what did you do to get out of student debt? You know, I know you had that biopsy, like, and like, what insurance did you use that you didn't have to cover that? Or like, you know, like I think talking to each other is huge in this way that people don't do. And I've had really cool conversations since then where like I was sitting at my podcast studio and I was waiting to go in and my producer was like, what are you doing on my phone? And I was like, I'm thinking about consolidating my loans. Like I could have lied, but I was like, I'm thinking about consolidating my loans. And he was like, I just did that. And I was like, you did? How was it? And we had like a 30-minute conversation about that like I got to talk to an actual person who had just done it. If I had just been shy or embarrassed and I didn't want him to know I had loans, I would have just been like a game on my phone and I would have gotten nowhere. So like, I think it's this huge thing where you have to talk to each other and you have to ask questions that maybe are seen as like weird, but everyone has to get better at talking to each other about these things. Otherwise, how do you get at the information?
But easier for you and me because you have a platform where you talk about money. When people come and talk to me about money, I'm a financial planner, so it's almost like going into the confession box of a priest and sharing your deepest, darkest financial secrets. But for anyone that doesn't have that platform to talk about money, what's the opening line? How do you kick off that conversation?
I think you can just talk to your friends. A lot of times, I mean, I don't know how it is with men, but a lot of times with women, we do talk to each other. Like we do end up being like, hey, I'm going to go on a date with this guy. You know him. Is he a good guy? We do check out things for each other. So like, I don't know why we don't go like, hey, like I'm getting married and like you're married. Did you have a prenup or like, what did you do? Not to say that we're all just sitting around talking about dating and marriage, but like there's things like, hey, I love to ask people what their rent is. Like, what do you pay for this place? Just talking to your friends. I've also had people tell me that they have like little meetings. They've set up like meetings with their friends where they just will sit around and like have like financial planning meeting. My one friend has like dinners with a couple other friends of hers and they like have this dinner like once a month and they talk about like, what are you doing that's good? And what can I tell you guys to do? And I just think like normalizing that among communities would be huge.
Yeah, I love that. I think as a man, I don't talk to my male friends about anything sensitive, emotional, anything like that. And as a Brit, of course, I'm reserved, so I don't talk about anything. So I've got double disadvantage. But
I've seen people talking about like investments, like that seems to be an okay thing.
Yeah, that's okay.
For people to discuss with each other. But I think because it is like a thing where if you're at the place where you're investing, then you're like, well, I love to talk about it.
If the investments are going well, we can talk about them. If they're going poorly,
exactly.
Maybe not so much. What about the emotional side of money? Because money contains a lot of emotional triggers for us. So which emotions do you think tie in with financial conversations?
No, it's horrible. I cry all the time. I cry because I don't want to do it. If I sit down and I have to like do taxes stuff, I'll like have to factor in like an hour of crying. Like I just don't, it's so tedious. And like, it's so like pulling teeth at things that you like don't want to think about. I think, I don't know. It was such a trigger for me. It made me cry all the time. I'm not sure if it's just because you have to like face what you do every day, or you have to like face how much money you've made in a year by like going through stuff or looking at stuff, or actually opening my bank account sucked. And it would be like, well, because you have to be like, okay, how have I done this year? Like, what am I able to do? What am I able to put away? What am I able to, I don't know. I just think like I tied it in with my self-worth a lot. Like I talked about, like I tied it in with, am I achieving my goals? Am I doing well? Which like often as a writer, a lot of the stuff that I'm the most proud of is not what paid me the most. It's just this capitalist thing where all of a sudden your entire worth is based on how much they paid you to do it. And I think it's just, it comes from childhood too. Like a big thing I talk about in the book is how your parents handled money really affects you and how you handle money or your guardians. And so like you might start being upset or angry because you like subconsciously remember your dad being angry about a bill or whatever. Like it's so deeply ingrained from family that like a part of the book that I talk about is it behooves you to sit down and like write down and think about like, what are some money memories I have from my parents? What are some things that I remember my guardians doing? What did I internalize where like, you know, did my family think people who had money were evil? Do I think that now? It makes sense to sit down and try to think about the messages that you've received and what they might have, if they serve you still.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because until you sort of sit down and think carefully about those childhood experiences, they are just subconscious, aren't they? And I have one, because I've gone through that exercise and sort of thought back to my childhood where I was counting my sort of savings, my piggy bank, and I was dropping coins out on the floor, and my dad shouted at me for making too much noise with his coins. And I know at the time my parents were going through a difficult financial situation because they had a small business, they hadn't been paid by one of their biggest customers, and it stays with you. You know, these memories stay with you, and they inform and they shape how you deal with money and your attitudes.
I have one where I think just like as a kid, you're just curious. Maybe I was like 5 or something. And I cut like a $1 bill in half just to like see what would happen. My parents were like, what the, like they were so mad. And then I sort of, I think was like, oh, I see. You can't, this thing is sacred. You can't mess with it. Got it. And that messes with you too. Cause you're like, wow, money has so much power. I'm not even allowed to, cause in your mind as a kid, you're like, it's paper. So you cut it because you cut paper. But they were like, no, not that paper. And then I was like, ooh, this paper is special. And then there you go.
It sticks in your head, doesn't it? It messes with you. It's amazing. What have you learned from the podcast conversations, from writing the book, that you didn't realize you knew before, or you didn't know before about money?
That everyone has problems. Everyone is struggling. I didn't realize how broken our healthcare system was here in the US. Medical debt is like the biggest problem here. I mean, it's huge. And it doesn't seem to have any end in sight. I didn't realize how much that was holding a lot of people down, and how secretive that is too, because people are embarrassed about medical stuff anyway. Like, I think there's also this element of like, oh, if you have cancer, you must have done something to deserve it or whatever. So I think I just realized how much everyone is struggling and how isolating it is, how everyone seems to think that they need to do it alone. I mean, there's varying specifics that like made me crazy, like that disabled people in the US are not allowed to have $2,000 in their bank accounts or else their benefits are cut, or that certain companies like PayPal or Venmo, if you're like a sex worker, they'll shut down your account and keep the money. A friend of mine had cancer and his insurance covered everything, but his teeth fell out because of chemo, and the insurance said that was cosmetic. So he had to pay for his teeth out of pocket. Like, just the way things work is so disadvantageous to literally anyone who isn't already rich. And I had no idea. I mean, I knew that subconsciously from my other social justice work, but I still had internalized all these messages about, no, it's your fault. It's your fault. It's your fault. And then slowly through the course of the podcast, I've become increasingly socialist and also been like, oh my God, almost nothing is anyone's fault.
It's incredible. Absolutely incredible. Gaby, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real pleasure chatting to you. Before I let you go, where can we find out more about the podcast and the book? Is there a good place to go?
Sure. The podcast is called Bad with Money. It's available wherever podcasts are. It's on the Stitcher network. And then Bad with Money book is available wherever books are sold. It came out in January. It's, IndieBound, Barnes & Noble, Amazon. I don't really want you to do Amazon, but you know what I mean? It's in its like third reprint. So I guess it's doing well.
Did I hear you've got a novel coming out or a comic or something?
Yeah, I have a graphic novel coming out October 8th, and that's called Bury the Lead, and that's like my newest project, and that's through Boom Studios. And that's fiction. That's like a crime thriller. So if you're like listening to me talk about money and you're like, God, I wish she had written about murder, you're in luck.
Gaby, thanks for your time. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Gaby for joining us for this episode of Informed Choice Radio. I hope I wasn't too much of a fanboy in that one. I've been a big fan of Gaby's work for a few years now, watching historically their YouTube channel, Just Between Us, which I always enjoyed. I'll put a link to her podcast and to her book in the show notes for this episode, which you can find at icradio.co.uk. Do take a moment to check out her book, check out her podcast, and say thank you to Gaby on social media for appearing on Informed Choice Radio. That always helps us out as well. But until next time, I'm Martin Bamford, and this is Informed Choice Radio. And remember, when it comes to your money, the more you know, the faster it can grow.